Ideas and books don't change people. People change people.
If you're a parent and you want your kid to be happy in life, the most important thing that they do is have good relationships.
How is your team set up to sort of give to each other and be vulnerable and share with each other and share that skin in the game?
It's about the consistency for 47 months that you're being pushed to be your very best.
It looks like magic when you see someone do something incredible, but what's underneath?
So why is it got to be so damn tough? So damn tough.
Welcome to the Toughness Podcast. I'm your host, Paddy Steinfort. We have a fascinating discussion ahead of us in this episode with two of the world's leading experts on tough cultures and what makes elite teams work, especially teams that operate under incredible stress. Our first guest is an author whose work I stumbled upon while I was trying to be a decent coach in my early days as a coach. Dan Coyle is the author, New York Times bestselling author of The Talent Code, was the first book that I came across talking about athlete development. But then he's stepped up his game with his next one, which was The Culture Code, and it's really a fascinating read. Dan, welcome to the show.
Hey, good to be with you, Paddy. Thanks for having me.
Great to have you here. Dan also does some special advisor work for the Cleveland Indians and speaks to a number. I mean, we'll talk about it more as the episode goes on, but speaks as an advisor and just a curious mind to a lot of people in high-level teams, high-performing teams in a bunch of different areas, including professional criminals. We'll circle back to that later in the show. And our second guest is Mike Erwin. Mike is still an active member of the U.S. Army Reserves. Is that correct, Mike?
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah, so still serving, but has been through the U.S. Army, a lieutenant colonel, and also now runs on a number of fronts, a few different operations that focus on developing positive relationships, positive teams, and character and development. Most specifically, Mike is assistant professor of leadership at West Point Military Academy. Mike Erwin, welcome to the show.
Hey, great to be here. Thanks so much.
And I'm going to start, as I normally do with these, is recounting the first time that I stumbled either over someone's work or individually in person. And Dan, for my running into you and your work, it kind of happened about the same time. I was fascinated with developing athletes. I was trying to do it myself. And then we happened to cross paths. I think you were coming in as a special visitor to the Philadelphia Eagles at the time that I was hanging around there doing a bit of work. Tell me how you end up becoming the guy as an author and a guy who writes books and does a bit of research. And then you, over a bunch of years, obviously, it doesn't happen overnight, but you move to being a guy that the Philadelphia Eagles and the Cleveland Indians and a bunch of other groups bring in to say, how do we make a better culture? Like, how did that journey start for you?
Yeah, it's funny. I guess it started by being in the middle of three brothers and having to compete with them a lot. We were Irish triplets, all of us about less than a year apart. And so when you're competing for, in our case, sort of food, love, space, and other essentials, you end up thinking about the edge that you can get. I studied pre-med in college, majored in English as well, and kind of almost went to medical school, made this turn into journalism. So I brought kind of a scientific curiosity about X-raying performance. Like, what is that made of? It looks like magic when you see someone do something incredible, but what's underneath? It's not really magic, right? There's something there. What is that thing? And that question led me into, journalism is a license to be curious. And so you can call up, it's the cool thing is you can call up people like you and say, hey, you seem really good at what you do. Tell me more about that. And then you can go visit them and you can watch them and you can capture what happens on paper. And that's sort of what I ended up doing, this weird career where I would sort of travel around the world looking for great performers and then going to them and trying to see what they do and then connect the dots scientifically to what's really going on.
That connecting of the dots was fascinating for me because the Talent Code itself was really one of the first, I would call them like pop psychology books, where it was like there was things in there that led me into a deep dive into psychology. And Mike and I have studied the same thing at different universities. But this was one of the books that hooked me and dragged me into the deep end. And that was about individual psychology and what happens to help an individual become an extraordinary performer. But then you pivoted from that, or maybe leveled up from that, if you will, from what makes an individual good to what makes a group good. And I'm only going to make the assumption that it happened because you were in there advising teams, like, how do you make this guy good? And you spotted some other things that you were like, yeah, but there's other things going on here that are above and beyond individual talent. Is that kind of how that evolved?
Yeah, that is. You go from one mystery to the next. And when you're in certain rooms, and we've all felt it, right? You walk into a school and it feels different in that school, or you walk into a classroom and it feels different in there. Like everybody's on point, everybody's switched on, everybody's learning more than in the classroom down the hall or a locker room. You feel it there. Winning locker rooms feel different. What's going on? What is happening there? So that mystery is what led me to start to investigate what's happening in these places that are incredibly tough, if we want to put it in the frame of this conversation, incredibly tough, incredibly resilient, incredibly connected. Where does that behavior come from? Again, it feels like magic, but it's not magic. There's a thing there. And so investigating that thing became what I got into.
You're right. I think everyone listening, and definitely everyone sitting on this screen or on this call, has felt it. You've been in a special place or a special team or somewhere it's like, this is different, right? And Mike, you've been in one that is perennially recognized as different. It's actually held up as different. West Point Military Academy is the academy for US Army graduates to go to and become leaders. Like, it's literally the school to be a leader of the best army in the world, the biggest army in the world. What was it that drew you to that? Did you want to be a leader, or it was like you kind of just ended up there?
Yeah, so it brings me back to over 20 years now. I'm getting old. But when I was thinking about it, I actually played baseball. I was looking at a bunch of different schools and ended up going to West Point. So part of the draw was baseball, but the biggest part was, that I did really fall in love with the concept of a 4-year process to grow into a leader. They talk about it being the 47-month journey. And, it's amazing how much effort and energy they pour into each and every cadet. Each class starts with about 1,200 and graduates about 1,000. So there's not a very high attrition rate. And the amount of mentorship, the amount of systems and rigor that's been put in to develop you intellectually, right? They have you take everything from philosophy and economics, to chemistry and calculus. So they make you be, sort of that range, right? They make you have a wide range of different backgrounds. And then, of course, the military training, the physical training, the social skills, like how do you lead people? How do you feed off of what's going on in a situation? And so the biggest thing that I came out of that journey with, and then, I graduated in 2002, and then I went back and I taught there on active duty from 2011 to 14. And I'm now still in the reserves, and I go back there every summer and I teach a course there to Army football players who have to make up the course. The biggest thing I've learned is that the development of leaders, right, and building like that, that organizational culture, it's a journey, right? It's not like, and this kind of goes back to one of my mentors, Jim Collins. He talks about all the time about the 20-mile march and the consistency that's needed. And it's not about the silver bullet or that one big thing that breaks through. It's about the consistent energy and effort that's being poured into individuals. In the case of West Point, to prepare you to lead, or in the case of building, as an institution, 220 plus years, or about 220 years now, right? It's about the consistency for 47 months that you're being pushed to be your very best.
That's a great way of putting it. You put out a few numbers there that I want to circle back on, like, immediately before I forget them. 47 months, which when you think about it, given the different time spans that we all spend in different places, like that's a fairly long time for a lot of people to say, I'm going to do this one thing, right? First and foremost. But secondly, you said that they start with 1,200 odd, 1,200, and then they end graduating 1,000. So there's 200 attrition. You say it's not much. It's still attrition.
Yep.
And I studied under Angela Duckworth, who's one of her most famous bits of research that launched the grit movement, was on West Point Military Academy and their beast barracks, right? And the fact that that's one of the things that weeds out. You said that it's actually a long process and it's not this one thing. But isn't beast barracks like notorious for being the one thing that'll, like, if you can't do that, you're not going to make it?
Yeah. And I think if you look at the attrition, there's definitely more in that 6 weeks. But yeah, there's definitely some, more that happens. The slope of the line is steeper there, but it is also like the academics over the course of that first 2 years, and just the grind of, getting about 5.5 hours of sleep a night, night after night after night, with all the practice.
Wait. Time. So that happens for 47 months while they're sleeping.
Pretty much. I mean, depending on who you are, between 5.5 and 6.5, it's rare to find a cadet that gets more than 6.5. And you can do it. And there's all this research, right, that talks about how important sleep is. And we know that. But there's also a lot of things that have to get done in a given day at West Point across all the domains. And you're going to have to choose to neglect some of them if you're going to prioritize 6.5 hours of sleep. So,
wow. And I'm raising my eyebrows and whistling in the background. Like, that's a big thing. But some of our listeners who are in the Army themselves, who are soldiers, operators, leaders, it's probably not as much of a surprise to them, right? This is normal life for some people, and not even in the military. If you happen to be a new parent, 5 hours of sleep is a luxury. Let's continue on with the West Point, or Mike, let's actually just talk about your time as active duty. How much credit, how much weight did you put on the support of other people when you started as a leader? And you were at West Point, how much weight did you put on the culture as a facet of leadership development versus this is just a good leader regardless of what room they're in?
Yeah. I mean, I think about my time at West Point and then, going on out into the Army. I'd say at first, the relationships that were the most important to me to be resilient and to be able to push through were my personal relationships with family and friends. But over time, those start to be supplanted by the relationships within the organization where you're spending all of your time. And for me, I started to see quite a bit of relationships at West Point and then out into the Army grow really strong, and they became critical. And especially on a deployment, when you're going through, something challenging like a 6-month or a 12-month deployment. I did a 12-month, an 8-month, and a 6-month. So I did about 26, 27 months deployed between 04 and 09 in various units. You have to, in theory, I think to really go through, you have to have both of those relationships. But going back to your question specifically about the culture of the organization, this is why I'm so fascinated by, Dan's work. It first started, with the talent code, spent a lot of time thinking about that, with my co-founder of one of my nonprofits. I started the Positivity Project. He was an All-American lacrosse player at West Point. His brother was a lacrosse player and a national champion at Johns Hopkins University, fell in love with the book. But as we dug into, and started to really think about the relevancy of all the research within the culture code, as I looked with that lens, looking back at the military organizations that I was a part of, it really helped me to better understand the role of the relationships, the sets of living relationships within the organization. And I frankly had, some organizations where the culture was incredible. It was amazing. And then there were other ones when it wasn't. Same unit, right? And very often, just different leaders. And the leaders could in some regard, be able to shape or to pivot the organizational culture within a relatively short period of time when you're in combat and you're deployed. It was pretty significant. But yeah, bottom line is the leaders that prioritize the relationships and that really prioritize you can't let the person to your left and your right down. That was what was super powerful and built up that strong organizational culture.
Interesting. You mentioned something there of you can't let the person to your left and your right down, which a few other guests, and not even military guests, have mentioned as part of being tough on the front lines, whether it's, a surgical team, whether it's in a sports team in the military. I'm going to ask, and I'm going to catch us here before we go any further, because there are a couple of words that keep bouncing around. One I normally ask guests to define from their experience. The other one isn't as regular, but it's very relevant to this conversation. I'm going to ask each of you in turn to say, what does toughness mean to you based on your experience in terms of what you've observed and also what you've lived? And also, what does culture mean? Because it's such a catchword. It's this trendy, hey, we've got a great culture. That I've actually had a coach one time that I coached alongside who got a little frustrated with this word that kept being thrown around because he came from a culture that was dominant. They'd won multiple championships within the league. He shifted to this other team that we were working on, that we were trying to build into that. And he was like, culture, it's not a thing. It's just that other group was good. We all did everything that we needed to do. And if someone didn't, they'd get slapped around the ears. It's not this magical thing. You can't just drink a can of culture and then everything's good. And so for those listeners or people who are I don't really know what you're talking about when you say that word, let's start there. We'll go to you, Dan, because you wrote about it first. What culture in your eyes, given that you've spent so much time looking at it, what the hell is it?
Yeah, it's a set of relationships working toward a goal. That's what it is.
Okay.
And you got to picture, and you're exactly right that word gets thrown around way too much. It gets thrown around just it's this magic dust that certain people have and certain people don't. That's not true. picture a school of fish moving through a coral reef, or picture a flock of birds in the sky moving through a forest, right? Together. They're connected. They're sharing information. They're watching each other, and they're navigating obstacles in search of a goal. Culture is functionality, right? Culture is performance. Culture is a set of connected people who can do shit together. That's what culture is. And at the end of the day, it's not about how they feel. It's not that it's warm and fuzzy. It's functional. And when you talk to people in great cultures, that's one of the great mistakes that people make when they think about culture. They think, Pixar's great at culture. San Antonio Spurs. Great cultures are where people are happy all the time and where everybody agrees with everybody all the time and where you kind of exist on this higher plane where everything's great. And that's actually not true. And if you think about your own experience, everybody's been a part of a great culture. And maybe it was a team, maybe it was a class, maybe it's family. And what you remember is that feeling of connection, that feeling of energy, that feeling of selflessness, that feeling of being part of something bigger than you. That's that feeling of being in the flock, moving force together. And it's not warm and fuzzy. It's not like, it can feel warm and fuzzy at times, but ultimately when you talk to great operators, especially in the military, a lot of people, for instance, will leave the SEAL teams and then they'll come back because they can't get that feeling other places. Or they'll leave a sports team or they'll leave their trading desk on Wall Street and then they'll come back because that's what culture is, right?
Yeah.
A set of relationships moving toward a goal.
Yeah. And it's funny that you mentioned that happens in the military. People leave sports teams, they leave great companies, similar effects of you have that feeling afterwards almost because it's almost like, all right, we did that work. It was tough and now I feel good about it as opposed to feeling good in the moment. I will often say when I might be sitting one-on-one with a coach or a player, the game, like they want to talk about, I want to feel better. I want to feel more confident. This relationship doesn't feel right. And the very throwaway but true line is the game doesn't give a shit how you feel. But the game's going to go on. The opponent's going to punch you in the face. These things are going to happen. And whether you want them to or not is irrelevant. Whether it feels good or not is irrelevant. It's whether you respond to them and, like you said, navigate through that coral reef or through a sky. That's the thing that makes it magic. Mike, over to you. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Dan.
People say, just to pop back for a sec, I've heard people also describe culture as solving hard problems with people you admire. Like that's another way to describe what you're talking about. You're with people you admire and you're solving hard problems together. And that's a feeling you don't get very often in life. It's a great feeling.
For sure. Mike, over to you. See if you can beat that very succinct definition.
So I'm going to bore you because I'm going to say I'm when it comes to culture, I'm a student of Dan Coyle. So, the sets of living relationships working together towards a common goal or purpose, it resonated deeply with me, that focus on the sets of relationships.
What do you mean by that? Sets of relationships?
Yeah, I mean, so it's easy. Like if you think about it, even sometimes just a one relationship is difficult to manage, right? But if you think about like an organization, think about all the various sets of relationships that go on with your peers, with people that, that lead you, with people that you're leading, right? It's this ecosystem. And the fact is that other word, like living, to hone in on that, like the living relationships, like they're evolving. But if you accept that definition of, organizational culture, think about the impact that an all remote workforce, for lots of places has on it. Like how are people finding ways to connect in a meaningful way to build those relationships, to grow stronger together? It's really hard now. Team Red, White, and Blue. This is the first nonprofit I started 10 years ago. I'm the executive director. We got a staff of 24. Serve 230,000 members across the country, and we've been remote and distributed and virtual in terms of our staff for like 6 years now. So not a big deal. But I've done a lot of work just in talking to people, friends who are leaders of business units, and they're just still trying to get their feet underneath them because they're so used to meeting with people and doing almost everything and making all their big decisions in person. Now they're having to make these big, huge decisions with people that they got relationships with, but they haven't seen in person and, given a handshake for 4 months, right? And so it's really fundamentally challenging organizational culture right now because, like, how are you maintaining those relationships? Because it looks so different for most organizations today than it did just 4 months ago.
Yeah, it's like you mentioned your team at Red, White, and Blue. There, we will. I promise, as we go through this entire episode, mention all of the nonprofits you've started. You're an incredible individual on that front. That's a small group of 20 people. It just so happens that earlier this week I was on a call with a leader at not so small group of people from a tech firm, Google, I'll mention their name just so everyone can get an idea of the size of this group and talking about, wow, they've got a great culture. It's one of the flags on the hill that everyone says, oh, it's a great culture, the googliness and all this sort of business. But they are dealing with exactly the same thing that you just mentioned there in terms of everyone's remote now. And it shouldn't be as much of an issue for a tech group, but it still is because there are conversations that happen at the water cooler, or there's a little bitch session that happens in an office and you happen to walk past and you're like, oh, you're talking about Smith? Let me jump in on this. And these are the things that happen in like you say, sets of relationships that now don't happen because I'm not walking past someone and I don't overhear something and I don't see someone sitting there staring at the wall or looking like they're about to jump out the window. And there are things that happen with human relationships that we're now missing. And we're looking at, I think everyone who is in that situation is looking at how do we either replicate or pivot so that we can build those same signals and sets of relationships in ways that we're not used to doing, in ways that we used to be able to rely on osmosis, for want of a better term. And so that instead of asking the normal question of what does toughness mean to you that I would normally throw out on this show, I'm going to ask on the same line of culture and of teams, think about in a platoon, Mike, that you might have been in or in a squadron. What's a tough team look like? What's a tough culture? What does toughness mean when it comes to culture? So we've defined culture is a set of living relationships moving together toward a goal. And there are a bunch of things that can stop those relationships from moving together toward a goal. A heap of opposition, a heap of circumstances, even the individuals within the group, right? What is it that separates a culture that might fall apart or not move towards the goal or the relationships fray versus a tough culture that is resilient?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would try to be as succinct as possible. I'd say there's something in there, some sort of combination between accountability, empathy, and just the ability to just be there for each other, right? Like in the face of the adversity. But to me, I really sum up toughness in such a same way as saying resilience, right? Like the ability to bounce back from adversity, the ability to push through challenges is how I summarize it. But it's definitely some sort of combination of holding these people accountable. You still got to get stuff done, right? But also being empathetic, knowing that different people are facing different challenges in different ways, with a high degree of variance in the world today.
So I'm going to grab two of the things you said there to make it a little clearer of a question. You said resilience and bounce back from adversity. So let's say some of the relationships are frayed. This happens in cultures. This happens in our life, in our families. There's one thing that can happen. And another thing is push through adversity. So you're still able to advance towards that goal that these relationships are working together in with part of this of being a culture, a set of relationships moving towards a common goal. Dan, to you, what are the things that in your observations and in what you've heard from some of the fascinating people you've consulted with to learn about this stuff, what are the things that repair frayed relationships or stop them from fraying in the first place as part of these sets of human relationships, and also allow groups to continue to push through to goals when maybe there's adversity and they haven't gone in the right direction?
Well, I was thinking, first of all, is that there is a paradox there in what you just described. And there's a tension, right? On the one hand, you're connecting, empathy, right? On the other hand, you are sort of saying you're challenging, accountability. I'm going to hold you to what we talked about. We're going to push. So I think great groups is a tendency in leadership to want to be one or the other, to be the connective love coach or to be the challenge tough guy coach, to be the rugged individualist coach. And I think great, truly tough teams embrace both. They embrace the tension that you actually have to toggle between both of those things. And the person who I encountered who did it the best was Greg Popovich of the San Antonio Spurs. At times, the toughest mofo you've ever met. He will go Google Greg Popovich yelling at Danny Green. It's got 4 million views because he's so over the top being tough with this guy. Then consider what Popovich does. He spends 6 figures on getting on food every year, getting his team together to connect, to not talk just about basketball, but to talk about life. Before an NBA final, he spent a locker room session talking about Australia's national holiday, Edimabo Day, and he had a player stand up and talk about that. Talk about empathy, talk about the whole person, talk about connection. And in the culture code, I tell a story about right after they lost the most painful loss maybe ever in the national NBA finals, the way he pulled the team together for a dinner, where he created an atmosphere that was so warm and so kind of loving and so full of brotherhood and camaraderie that they were able to respond to that loss as a team. So their GM calls it the best active leadership he's ever seen in sports. What he did, not on the court, but at this dinner. So he embraces this idea that it's not one or the other, it's both. It's really both. And
really important.
I think that idea is one that we all struggle with, because our instinct is to kind of gravitate more toward the toughness, accountability thing and less toward the empathy piece.
Or there are some who gravitate towards the empathy and connection piece. And like you said, they don't do the toughness bit, or what they might say is tough is being hard on someone. One of the cool definitions of just individual toughness that came out from one of the previous episodes was a former Navy SEAL who mentioned that he saw toughness as being psychological flexibility. And it is something that within the literature and definitely within my work, it's much more about, it's not just about gritting your teeth and hanging on. Sometimes it's about being able to let something go. Sometimes it's about being able to take a different point of view. And it's this flexibility that allows you to handle whatever situation happens, to maintain those two things that you really need: good connections and continued pursuit of that goal without giving up. The example you gave of Pop and that dinner after Game 6, I think you said it was, again, you can probably find stuff about that online, but a fascinating example of an exercise that you would do psychologically. Mike, you might have come across this in your studies, but the concept of developing psychological flexibility by looking at the permanent self versus things that come and go. Game 6 happened. It was bad. Most teams would curl up in a ball or go off in their separate ways and be like, we'll lick our wounds tonight. We'll come back to practice tomorrow. This action by Pop was to bring the group together. They already had it planned. They were going to have a dinner to celebrate. It didn't happen. They still had the dinner because it was like, you guys are humans who are going to, regardless of whether we win or lose, you're still going to be you, and I'm still going to love you, and we're still going to connect regardless, because we've still got a job to do. And you mentioned some of your work there with Team Red, White and Blue, Mike, around the continuity of identity for soldiers, in your case, who finish their career and need to then discover that they're actually still a human without being in the army. And I talk about my own personal experience of being a former athlete, some of the athletes I work with who finish their career, and there's an identity crisis of, well, if I'm not a football player or a basketball player or an Olympian, then what the hell am I? And it's another example at the individual level of psychological flexibility. Tell me your experience there, Mike, both personally, because you had to live it, but also working within that foundation and dealing with guys and girls who are facing that themselves. Does me throwing out the term psychological flexibility?
Yeah.
Resonant?
Yeah, it does. I like that a lot. When I look at my own experience, after I was basically in the Army for 7 years, 3 deployments, and I went to grad school at the University of Michigan. I was in the personality psychology PhD program, but I was still in the Army. I was a captain. And so I still went through that major transition myself from 2009 to 2011. And I look back at that and I realized wow, this is tough. I still had healthcare. I still had my job and a salary and all that. I was like, man, I can't imagine going through this and having all those things gone now. Right? Like so many soldiers or servicemen and women do. I think that it gave me a deep sense of appreciation for just how much of my identity was hung on combat veteran, someone who is going out to the military or going on to graduate school. And I really had to grapple that, up close, grapple with that. But yeah, I think that to me, I've just seen it a lot more since then. Team RDB is 10 years old. A lot of what we did is we helped veterans as they were taking off the uniform to stay healthy, but also to find a new identity beyond just, soldier, airman, Marine. And so I've seen it really up close now with a lot of my friends who, are special forces leaders over here at Fort Bragg. I'm also friends with, and come to know people like Apollo Ono and Kerry Walsh and other people, Tim Hasselbeck and Trent Dilfer, and a lot of people who have made that transition from like this high level, be it the Olympics or be it sport or, be it whatever it is. And then they've moved on, to other things. And so the idea of framing toughness as psychological flexibility, I think really resonates because it's hard to do. It is really challenging to be able to do. And I think so much of it is because we get wrapped up in, what everyone else sees us as, right? Versus what we know we're bigger than just the game or whatever it is that we did. Think about it, like you're an athlete, you retired at 40, you lived to 80, you got 40 years post athlete journey, where you can go redefine yourself in a whole bunch of different ways, which I think is one of the reasons, the loss of Kobe was, something that really, hurt people so bad, because he was like a guy who was like going through that transformation post athlete. So anyways, I could talk forever on the topic, but yeah, I mean, definitely that definition resonates.
I'm glad it resonates, because it's something I use often with people who are dealing with it. And when it rings true for someone who's been through it, that's usually a good sign. Flipping back to Craig Popovich as a perfect example of, well, not perfect, no one's perfect, as a great example of someone who was flexible, who was able to go from being fire to ice and then back again, or in between if he needed to. Dan, in your observations of other groups, is it always necessary that there's an individual who's a talisman or a figurehead that carries that characteristic with them?
I don't think so. I think it's more about creating norms in the groups where each person has a role that they play and that everybody understands what those norms are. The leader has a lot to do with it. I'd say the biggest moment in any group's formation is when a leader demonstrates fallibility.
For those who don't speak big English, what does fallibility mean?
That they can screw up, that they're human, that they don't get it right all the time, and that they need help, that they actually rely on the group to bring help. That not just they need it or they're dumb or they need it, but that the group is working together to figure out what's going on, that they're not going to look to the one person for the answer. There's a Navy SEAL named Dave Cooper who I came to meet, and Dave was the command master chief of the Navy SEAL Team 6 group that got bin Laden. And then the way he put it was that the four most important words a leader can say are, "I screwed that up." And I think that concept really surprised me when he said it, because I was always thinking, well, no, leaders are very confident and they project confidence. And if they need to be absolutely bulletproof when they present to their group. And Dave really flipped that for me. And the reason that that's so important is that it gives people permission to tell each other what's really going on. Leaders often get insulated from the truth. And by demonstrating fallibility, by saying, look, I need you to tell me if you notice something. I need you to fix me when I make a wrong mistake. And it gives this new model for leadership that I've heard. I mean, I'm sure you're familiar with Preston Klein and Coleman Ruiz's work at their Mission Critical Teams Institute. But they put it this way. Normally we think of leadership as like the tip of the spear. And they said, well, the leader's not just like the tip. A group is actually more like a rolling spike ball. At different moments, different people are stepping up to say, here's what's happening. Let's go this way. And then somebody else steps up and say, here's what's happening. Let's go this way. So they're sharing those roles, and they have a norm where that's accepted.
That's what they do, yeah.
Accepted, but they hold each other accountable to do it. Like, no. Tell me what's happening. Let's do better. Make me accountable. Let's be accountable to each other. And that's where you get that real group psychological flexibility, if you want to call that. Because, man, the world moves fast. Like, the idea that one person should have it all in their head and tell everybody what to do is kind of crazy. That's a bad model. That's a bad model for making good decisions. But the idea that we have this group brain that is constantly looking around and tuned into each other and sharing information so that the group can make the right decision, that seems like a better model for more toughness, more flexibility, and more performance.
Yeah, I mean, you've mentioned two characteristics there. One of the team of being flexible, and we spoke about that at an individual level. But you also mentioned specifically for a leader, one of the biggest things for them is to have fallibility, or some people might call that vulnerability, or some people might just be keeping it real. Like, whatever the term is, they can put it out there and say, I screwed that up. And those 4 words is a key, a mental and emotional trait of top leaders of good cultures, or top proponents of good cultures. I'm going to flip to you, Mike. Is there anything that you look at as you watch people graduate, grow, and evolve through West Point, both in your own experience and also you observe people doing it nowadays? Is there one key trait that you look at and you're like, that's what actually makes someone really good in this environment? Other than, and if you can just be like, no, those 2 things are pretty good, we'll run with that.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I think that because of, Dennis talked about how fast the world moves and how fast things change, I think it's really kind of tough to like narrow it down. I know obviously some of the research that, Angela did really kind of looked at, grit, right? Passion and perseverance and the role that, those things play. I certainly buy that. But I think that, for somehow it's the combination, of those character attributes, like the ones that encompass grit. But I think that I keep coming back to this word resilience, and I think about the world today and the challenges we face, and they're on multiple layers. And I just think about how important it is to be able to not to let the adversity and the setbacks and all the problems of the world to affect you too much, right? Because you have to maintain hope and optimism to move forward in the face of adversity. But not just that, but I think like just so much change happening right now in the future. I mean, think about like, we struggle with this so much as humans to think about the future, but like self-driving cars, and think about like all the evolution of the economy and all that. If you're not agile or adaptable or flexible and resilient in some sort of way, I mean, there's so much change on the horizon that is going to be really difficult, I think, to thrive, in the world of the future if you are not able to be flexible and agile enough to be able to adapt to how things are going. If you haven't been able to adapt in these 4 months personally, your personal relationships and your professional relationships, like you're in a tough spot right now.
It's tough. Yeah. I'm going to grab a few of the threads there and pull them together with this question that I've been dying to ask ever since I read about the Pink Panthers in your book, Dan. And I'll explain to listeners. In fact, I'll leave it to you to explain what that means. But we've mentioned being flexible. We've mentioned being vulnerable. We've also mentioned the value of human connection and sets of relationships to deal with things that go astray. And you also mentioned the work of the group who does work on mission critical teams, which is really relevant to the elite athletes that we work with, to tech firms that are making billion-dollar decisions, to heart surgeons, to military operators. Obviously, like if something happens wrong here, we're all screwed. And this group that you brought to light in your book, Pink Panthers, which is a professional criminal organization, as is the easiest way I'm going to describe it, is a great example of, if someone in that group screws up, they are all literally screwed. They're all going to jail or they're all dying, right? They are a mission critical team in a very, very different sense, but they are. And I'm really curious whether those things that we've said, whether it's the flexibility, the vulnerability, or the connection, like did they apply just as clearly to that group as they did to other groups in your experience? Well, firstly, did you sit with them? Did you put balaclava on and go into a bank?
I wish I had. I ended up spending a lot of time with a lot of people who had sat with them.
Right.
By the time I got to it, a lot of them were in jail, so they were a little bit hard to reach. But this was a group that sort of came around in the early 2000s. They came out of Serbia, sort of this mysterious group that was doing these smash and grab robberies. They were incredibly efficient. They were incredibly fast. They were incredibly effective. They sold tens of millions of dollars really boldly from a variety of jewelry stores around the world. And for a while, everybody thought, these must be special operations soldiers. The way they operate so effectively, they're highly organized. They must be like a troop. It turns out they were this really loosely organized group of like former students and lawyers and kind of normal people who had come together in this sort of free range sort of cells. And the main thing that they had that made them unique, besides this incredibly devotion to each other, when one of them got put in jail, they would break each other out. I mean, they were just incredibly devoted as a team to each other. The one thing they had in common was this skin in the game. And I would the things you mentioned, I would say shared vulnerability is like the most underrated driver of performance. When you talk about people who are making these big decisions, talk about mission critical teams, I think the idea that all of them stand to lose massively if they screw up is really stand to lose. It's one, not just sort of lose reputation, but really lose a lot was at the core of their success and is the core of a lot of great teams' success. And there's a great book about this called Skin in the Game by Taleb that I recommend anybody who wants to go deeper on this.
And if you're reading his stuff, also Anti-Fragile is basically a summary of everything we're talking about.
It's incredible. It's incredible. But this idea that when you actually are super invested, and in the Pink Panthers case, it was that they would live together for a month and divide up the tasks. Someone would case the jewelry store for a month and figure out exactly how to approach it. They would do these elaborate rehearsals. So it wasn't just that each of them had a job that was separate from each other. They were embedded in living together and really each had skin in the game. And so that idea of how can you as a team share vulnerability, we were in the leader admitting fallibility is a big piece of it, but simple ways. Another, not that this is turning into a book podcast, but The Captain Class by Sam Walker goes and talks a lot about how great leaders are not necessarily the ones who you would think of. They're the ones who are carrying water for the team, who are making physical and mental and emotional sacrifices for the team. And that idea of sacrifice, I think, speaks to this as well. How is your team set up to sort of give to each other and be vulnerable and share with each other and share that skin in the game? to me, that's a really underrated source of power and teamwork and connection.
It's fascinating you shared the tidbit there of them living together. It's not the sexy Ocean's 11. We're going to meet at the hotel 30 minutes before we do the robbery. It's all planned out. You're the security guy. You're the beef. Like, this is something that they ensconced themselves, and they actually created role flexibility almost where, okay, you do this and you do that. And so if someone falls down, we've got it covered, right? How long would they live together to do that?
Months. They have months. And they were one time they had to cancel a robbery because there were two groups they didn't know they were living near each other, but there were two groups planning to hit the same jewelry store. So they had to ultimately cancel and figure it out. But that's how there were sort of independent cells, but each of them would be sort of living together. So exactly. I love that. It's not Ocean's 11. It was more like a family.
Yeah. And the shared vulnerability you mentioned is a fascinating plus sacrifice. It's a tie, Mike, to your work beyond the red, white and blue group, but to the work that you do with school kids now on developing positive relationships. We mentioned at the start of the show that it's an important part of being able to be tough for yourself is having support of others. And obviously a tough team is able to support each other. Like you just said there with the criminals breaking each other out of prison, is that's a very extreme example of a supportive relationship in one sense. The various authors and experts and books names, but Stephen Covey is a deacon in this area of his model of trust being built on character and competence is a fantastic example here. I think that solidifies that someone who is willing to be vulnerable and also will make sacrifices. Like, it's not about me, even if I look stupid. That's very tough to do for a leader, to admit vulnerability, to put themselves out there and to make them reliant on someone else in the team. It's a tough thing to do, right? It's a different form of toughness, but that then is a signal to others in the group of character, of like, I can trust this person, and that builds a stronger bond. Would you say that actually, let's ask this, because I want to, before we finish, very important when we talk about great in theory, like, how do we change this? If we're a team that's in the middle, like, how do we shift it? If I'm someone who's got okay relationships, how do I make them tougher and stronger? So, Mike, let's talk about the work that you do in schools.
So the nonprofit is called the Positivity Project. So we're about 5 years old now. Mentioned before, my co-founder is the one who got me interested in Dan's work, first starting with Talent Code. But bottom line is our mission is to empower America's youth to build positive relationships. And so when you look at the data, right, from positive psychology, we know that if you're a parent and you want your kid to be happy in life, right, the most important thing that they do is have good relationships, ideally with their family, but also with their friends, their coworkers, their teammates, right?
As key decisions would say, other people matter, right?
Correct. And that was, my mentor. I studied directly under him for 2 years, and, that was it, right? Like the role, but it's not just about happiness and well-being. It's also the path is, Dan talks about, to organizational success. And so I ask people all the time, do you want your kids to be successful? Well, of course you do. So I would argue that in America and probably the world, like the K through 12 education system spends a disproportional amount of time, this is a slightly controversial view, but on academic and intellectual knowledge, and not enough on teaching soft skills, social skills, character strengths, and teaching kids how to connect with each other.
Tell me what that looks like, because I'm picturing half of a locker room that I work with.
Yeah.
Right? And they're all big grunty guys. And they're like, what the fuck is this all about? Like, we're not here. If we did this in a locker room, they'd be throwing things at me within minutes of saying, let's talk about soft stuff. And so if you're a former military operator, you teach people in the military, you know what some people are like who work in that field. Like, try and explain to someone who's listening, what does it look like to work on soft stuff?
Yeah. So I think that, to me, so we boil it down to a couple things. One, and by the way, like, as we know, and this is why Dan, has broken it down, right? The sets of living relationships, boom, boom, boom. Like, relationships are hard, like so hard, right? There's no silver bullet. There's nothing even remotely close to a silver bullet, right? And so, like we say, the way I describe it is the analogy of like fertile ground will help it's not going to guarantee that you have a bumper crop, right? But it's going to give you the conditions to be able to grow better crops. To me, right, it's number one, do you see the good in yourself? Do you see the character strengths and recognize them in you? And then just as importantly, do you see them in other people? So I would argue that that's not like the silver bullet to building great relationships, but because there's shared suffering, there's, the accountability, there's all these other kinds of things. But there is no doubt a role if I can see the good in myself, because as humans, we're really good at seeing like our own weaknesses, right? And then we're really good at seeing the weaknesses in other people, right? So if we train our mind to see the good in ourselves, to see perseverance, integrity, humility, fairness, forgiveness, if we see those things in ourselves and we see them in other people, we now have the common vocabulary to see ourselves more clearly and to understand other people better. That gives us the language to be able to build the language and the understanding to be able to build stronger relationships. But I would just sum it up by saying like, yeah, you're like, not everyone's going to, sometimes I go in and I talk to people like, all right, man, I don't need this, like leadership, or this soft stuff. But I think that people over time are coming to the realization that, as we've talked about at the beginning of the conversation, that relationships are not just all about like this soft stuff, right? But it does boil down to, I think a lot of it is how well do you understand other people? Because a relationship is two-way. It's not just like you can know yourself until till the cows come home. If you don't learn how to see and understand and see the good in other people, then you are going to by default see their weaknesses and their flaws. And it's really hard to build a strong relationship with someone when you see a lot of good in yourself, right? But you don't understand who somebody else is.
Yeah. Side note, more out of curiosity and fun than anything. You say soft stuff, and I've heard it said a lot, and I might have even been guilty of using the term, right? But then you immediately move to the truth of relationships are fucking hard. And having these conversations is really tough. Particularly like when we're under the pump, it's like, damn, that is one of the hardest things you're going to do as a coach. Sit down with a player and like connect when he's just played shit and you screwed up the play call that was perfect. Like, that's really hard. So why do we call it soft stuff if it's really hard?
It feels hard, but I think it's not just hard to do emotionally, but it's also like there's a hard physics behind it, right? There actually is a math there that I think you're tapping into by saying, look, no, it's not magic. It does feel magic when it happens because we're in the realm of emotions, right? Emotions always feel really powerful and mysterious. Why do I suddenly feel happy or angry? But there's actually sort of some physics and some math here where it's like, no. If you express vulnerability to someone, if you say, I'm sorry that I did this, or I think I made this mistake, it can create, really predictable responses. And so this idea that, like, we understand with our physical body, right? That if you're going to go get stronger, you need to go to the gym and you need to feel pain. And when you feel that pain, you're going to have this response where your body's going to get stronger. Your muscles are bigger. If you don't feel that pain, you will not get stronger. And I think we're starting to learn that in emotional language too, in the emotional world, that relationships, while it is hard to build relationships, there's a physics where that really is rooted in vulnerability and self-reflection and understanding yourself and understanding others. And if you can figure that out, if you can actually lean into that experience and to those emotions and be willing to feel that emotional burn, just like when you feel a physical burn, it's like, oh no, this is actually a good thing, right? We didn't always know that about exercise. We used to think it was bad. Like you could die if you exercise too hard. And that's sort of partly true, but it's not totally true. So this idea that the pain is the gain, and you start to realize, no. When I express my vulnerability as a leader, or when I really try to understand another person, it feels painful and weird, but that's exactly what I would need it to feel in order to create growth.
Yeah. I can vouch for the fact that the belief of dying from exercise still exists. I went for a run the other day and was very close to passing away. But that's because it was my first run in probably a few weeks, maybe longer. And it's a bit like that when it comes to relationships, right? I had a mentor who was one of the first people that introduced me to culture work, Ray McLean. Speaking of books, really, this guy started me on the path to where we are now, where I am now, but particularly in this area. Any Given Team by Ray McLean, really worth a read because he basically does this work day to day with some of the best teams in Australia and started out working in the Air Force in Australia, doing leadership development by dropping people in the middle of the bush in groups of 5 or 6 and saying, work it out. And a lot of it led to these sort of discoveries that one of the models he used would be he would take a pyramid, but he'd flip it on its head and say, these are the levels of communication. At the top is where most people are. That's why it's wide. And at the bottom is where very few people get to. And at the top is like grunt. You walk past someone, you live in the same building. You're like, what's up? You barely say a word, but you are communicating. There's just not much going on. And then the next level is we'll talk about stuff and things. Like, did you see the basketball game last night? How about Donald Trump? Like, you talk about things that maybe Trump's not a great example, that things that aren't really emotionally invested, right? It's just pretty safe stuff. Then we can talk about other people, because if I know Mike and Dan knows Mike, then Dan and I can talk about Mike, but it's still relatively safe because Mike's not involved in the conversation. So there's no identity crisis or worry about hurting anyone. And then he draws a big, thick line above the last two levels. And the next one is talking about Mike to Mike. So we're going to have a conversation. And the last one is about, I'm going to talk about me and Mike with Mike, because that's a whole nother level of like vulnerability. And like, this could really hurt one or both of us. And that thick line after the third level is like, it's talking about whether you say going below the line or taking a breath and getting underwater. Like, the ability to go down there once is like me going for a run the other day. It hurts because I haven't done it in a while and it might screw up and I might have to call it before I'm finished. But if I do that every day, when I really need to go down there, it's going to be much easier to get done.
Right. And that gets into about why it's, two things, to what Dan said and what you just said, Patty. Number one, this is why it's so hard, like to be able to get there, like especially those initial times. I mean, I've spent some time with Brene Brown, kind of the queen of vulnerability, several times at West Point, before, she got really big. This is like 2012.
Before TikToks.
Yeah. Yeah. So she, like, I literally spent like 45 minutes to an hour talking to her. Like literally, she calls it like a vulnerability hangover. Like, the next day you literally feel like, much like, and so what Dan said really resonated, the idea of like framing it up and comparing it to the physical hurt that you feel. We all know, if you want to get stronger, you want to get faster, you got to go out there and you got to do those 800 repeats or whatever it might be. But it's pretty interesting to think about it in terms of that same way, like emotionally and all that, because going back to my point about it's hard. It's just not something like, oh yeah, man, can't wait to go out there and, just like lean in my vulnerability and knowing that, like, yes, it is a vulnerable place to be, but then also like literally like you don't know how it's going to go at the end. And then that next day, like you really feel, man, I'm exhausted. And that's how I found just talking to her for 45 minutes. Like next day, I literally felt like I was just like moving in slow motion because she pulled out some complicated stuff with combat rotations and all that stuff. So
I'm sure she's rapt to hear that you felt exhausted to talking to her. But it is a great example and a really true, like I've heard you say earlier in the show a few times, Dan, like everyone here has felt this or experienced it. I'd be amazed if most people can't say, yeah, I've had a conversation before that went deep below that line to like we had to go underwater and hold our breath for a little bit. And that later that day or the next day, you didn't feel some repercussions from it. And I think it's a great example. So Mike, you're saying that you can actually practice that and like deliberately build that up as part of what you do with people?
Yeah. I mean, I think that like that's, you've got to be able to get there because the idea of just going there, kind of like you talk about a run, like if you go for a 5-mile run once a month, it's never going to get any easier. It's never going to be something that you can eventually look forward to,
Doesn't, I promise. I'll be doing it 5 months in a row.
Yeah. So, exactly the analogy resonates, right? But the idea of getting there more consistently and training it, right? Like within our mind to be able to go there. But again, it requires a certain amount of energy, a certain amount of time and space. And then also just the knowledge to be able to know that like you can do this, right? Because there's a lot of people who just, like I catch myself sometimes be like, don't have the energy. Don't have the energy right now or the time.
I'm not a people person or whatever it might be. Yeah. Let me ask, what Mike's describing there as actual intervention exercises, or here's a program you can do, or here's a conversation template that can actually take you there, right? These things exist and people do apply them. Have you seen them organically in practice? Like you mentioned Pop as a living example of like someone who was hard and then soft. Yeah. But in other areas, you also described some of the stuff that the Pink Panthers did as a split group of cells. But can you think of any other examples where you're like, this person was actually really good at teaching people or showing people, taking them by the hand and walking them through those sort of conversations?
Yeah, I think modeling is really underrated as a tool, in the effect. I heard somebody put it this way. It's like ideas and books don't change people. People change people. And we can all think of people in our lives. If we all closed our eyes right now and think of people who affected us, it's very easy to think of them. And a lot of us think, oh, what would they do in this situation? Right. And that ends up being like this compass that lets you through you're in a tough situation. All of us do this little mental trick where we're like, oh, what would my Uncle Bob do? What would Commander so-and-so do? And it really is powerful, and it seems kind of woo-woo, but I think it speaks to the underrated power of presence and modeling. And that's to sort of connect back to some other threads we've talked about today. That's why that shared space and that is so important, because you're sort of modeling for each other how to be. I've seen the effect in my work with the Cleveland Indians. We have a mutual friend, Jay Hennessy, who came from the SEALs team and has been the head of leadership and development there for a while. I know he brought Mike in to speak to the group. I know the group. And it's been super interesting over the last, 2 years to see the effect Jay's presence and other people's presence has had on each other. There is contagious, it's sort of the way he leads and the way he communicates and the way he holds himself gives everybody a really clear model on how to do that. And so, to your original point, it's useful to have kind of a model or a reflective exercise. But man, if you can create the environment where you're filling your windshield with really clear people who are doing this stuff every day, that's incredibly powerful, not for just individuals, but for whole groups. That's the oldest software there is, right? Like watching other people, getting motivated by them and copying them, learning how they think. It's one thing to be given a step-by-step bit of instructions, but a real mentor, and you guys have mentioned several mentors, the power of mentorship is super powerful. And the power of a mentor is that we can access how they think about stuff. Well, how would they think about this? How would they behave? How would they feel about this? And I think that's incredibly powerful.
It's I'm going to ask a second last question before I get to the last question. And this is Dan, just pulling the thread on what you mentioned there of that's the importance of shared space to watch modeling. And it is the oldest software in the world. I love that terminology. For those who work in software, like the person I was talking to at Google, who are now separated and they can't do any of that old software and they have to use a new model to somehow model and display and learn by osmosis. What would be your recommendation for people who are trying to build a culture remotely right now? It's a different world. From someone who studied it a lot, what would you recommend?
I guess I'd say three things. When you're at a distance, you have to create connection, you have to amplify your warmth. We're now operating through these little portals, right? Where you can just see a little portion of somebody. So in order to get a signal through that, you got to amplify it. You got to turn up your warmth. That could be your facial expression. That could be how much you pick up your laptop and show them your office and your pets and pictures of people you love. It could be the way you hang out together, exercise together online, have events that have nothing to do with work. Second thing I would say is deepen your curiosity. Think more about other people. Think more about your own vulnerabilities and sharing them. Don't walk past questions. Stop and really think about how to dig into tensions together. Deepen your curiosity about tensions. And the third thing I would say is to practice reflection more. We're at a distance with each other. And so to reflect, both creating opportunities to reflect together, but also reflecting alone on continually figuring out what matters, where you should be going next, what your priorities should be. Those are things that happen naturally when you're together. So when we're apart like this, I think it's on each of us to sort of practice reflection more as a group to say, wait a minute, we spent a week working like crazy. We've all been on Zoom calls all day. Let's hang on a second. Let's all list the 3 things that we should do next week. And let's talk about those 3 things. Let's rank them. Let's figure out where we should go, what the high purpose thing is. So those 3 things, I would say, amplify warmth, deepen curiosity, and practice reflection.
Also very clear structure as well. I appreciate it. Mike, anything you would add to that? For those of us who want to learn or have an idea of how you would help someone work remotely?
Yeah. So first, I think going back to, so the title of the book that I co-authored called Lead Yourself First, right, really talks about the importance of solitude and reflection. That's a big part of it. It's been something that's been sort of under siege throughout the past 15 years in the information age, really 10 years since mobile technology, Wi-Fi, et cetera. All those moments we used to have, just quietly reflecting in our minds have evaporated. I think that's especially the case right now because we spend so much more time on our phones and on our computer screens and with Zooms all day long. So I absolutely plus one that third point. I also go to that first point that Dan made is one of the other key points I talk about. I talk to my team about this a lot. Most people really struggle with this. I intentionally work on smiling, right? I'm talking right now, I'm smiling and I know it, you have to be intentional about it because if you're not, sometimes I got people who sit there the whole meeting like this and it's man, are you bored to tears? Are you having a bad day? So knowing a lot of people just are, yes, sometimes they're off doing email or they're looking and reading an article. So they're kind of zoned out, but a lot of times they're just not aware of how important it is like to make that connection. That again, if they were doing that same thing when you were talking to them in person at the table, at their desk, you'd be like, come on, man, like what's going on? You all right? Is everything okay? And so being really intentional. And I think there's a whole market out there for people, to just be getting better trained on how to, like, I like that word, amplify, like your emotions and your presence there. And then, the final thing I'd say, in terms of like, building culture, going back to the relationships thing, is the basis, of the definition here, which again, I agree with Dan's, take on this 100%. I think a lot of it does boil down to how are we working through tension and conflict? Because tension and conflict, right, the vacuum that can fill it, right, is often negative or can cause friction or cause problems in relationships and erode that organizational culture. And I think that in person, we know this from the research, right, that it's easier to have conversations when you can, because there's all the body language, there's all that. It's just easier to have a conversation virtually. It's having arguments is different, having disagreements is different. And so I think really being intentional about all of that, I think carries more weight right now, because you're going to have friction and things pop up and disagreements happen. But like how they are resolved, I think is much more challenging in the virtual environment. So I think really getting intentional about how you approach conflict is more important than ever.
Yeah. And I like the term there, approach conflict, because one of the things that we'll often work on with coaches or leaders in sports teams as an example, but I'm sure it applies in many regions, is experiential avoidance is often one of the biggest things that eats away early. Before you know there's an issue, that's the thing that really degrades and erodes the trust, because we all kind of know we need to talk about this, but let's just like keep skirting around the edge of it. So approaching conflict is actually a healthy way to go about it. Very challenging in these times. Guys, this has been fascinating. I could definitely talk forever on this. I'm sure both of you could, but our listeners probably can't listen for 5 hours at a time. So I want to wrap it up with this last thing. Mike, you do a lot of work. We've mentioned a couple of your initiatives in not-for-profits who work in these areas. And Dan, you've devoted years, decades of your life to learning and sharing these things. What do you both hope to achieve out of the work that you do? And I'm going to throw it out there for either. You're both going to have to answer it. We're not hanging up till you do, but I'll let you choose who goes first.
I think, Dan, you want to take the first swing, or I can?
You're probably going to have a way better answer than me. I think about the word impact a lot. As I started out as a writer, sort of in writing, the sort of, you first see the book as the first reward. Oh, I wrote a book. Like, here it is. I got there. And then when you do that a couple of times or once, you sort of realize, oh, wait, that's not it. There's an impact piece. And impacting, I've seen the way ideas move through organizations. I've seen the way ideas can change the way people work together. And so I guess I'm just really focused on impact. And I think in the end, like, impacting how we educate each other as children, as an adults would be something to aim for. I think that education piece is massive. And I think Mike's living proof that it can be done, and it can be done in these really powerful ways. So I find that incredibly inspiring.
So I've actually, it's funny that you asked the question in a slightly different way than as I've been asked it before, but I think about this, and I've actually sort of kind of put fingers to the keyboard on this, trying to think about it. So when people often introduce you, right, they introduce you as, hey, you're New York Times bestselling author, you're the founder and executive director of Team Red, White, and Blue, right? Like, people often introduce you through your title or through what you've done. And I think a lot about, we've all heard the, resume versus eulogy thing before, the idea of like, what have you accomplished, like, versus the impact you've had on your life. And hopefully there's a tight correlation there between the two. But, I really, whenever I kind of offer my bio to people, I start with this idea of like my character. And so I talk about my leading character strengths. So, I'm an enthusiastic, grateful, and optimistic leader. I kind of hone in on my top 3 character strengths of gratitude, optimism, and enthusiasm. Then I say like that I dedicated my life to serving the nation and empowering people to build positive relationships and become more resilient. So like, that's that impact, that lasting resolve of everything I'm involved in. Started a startup Catholic high school outside Fort Bragg here, Father Capodanno High School, the Positivity Project, Team Red, White, and Blue, the Army Reserves, the work that I do, with the organizations around Lead Yourself First, and the next book that I'm working on, which will, I think, resonate with both of you, called Leadership is a Relationship, right? Talking about the role of relationships in leadership. So all of that to me, and I live on 32 acres, with pigs, chickens, ducks, soon goats, and I got 5 kids, that are 10 and younger. So like, I've got a lot going on in my life, but to me, it's all a part of like this bigger ecosystem of, one, tapping into my character every single day, because I'm not enthusiastic and optimistic, and grateful. then that's not going to work, right? In any the domains of my life. But then it's just the whole idea of like, how can I empower as many people as possible through these various organizations to build positive relationships and to become more resilient in the process? Because we know when you build positive relationships, you're going to be happier, more resilient, and then more successful in life.
I appreciate the way you broke that down into resume versus eulogy. And yes, eulogy is important, but that's one heck of a resume you just threw out there as well with all those, like, yeah, you've started a high school, you've got 2 non-for-profits, you work in the army, like, yeah, okay. Making me feel pretty humble. And it speaks volumes to the level of people that we're able to get on this show because of the people we're trying to help and the messages we're trying to spread. So I thank you both for being here. Mike, if people do want to find you and any of those numerous things that you mentioned on your resume, where's the best place to track you?
Yeah, LinkedIn is probably the best place to find me. I'm on multiple, different social platforms, but I'm spending more and more time on LinkedIn and less time everywhere else.
And the name of your book that was published, we'll pump everyone up to future projects later, but if they can find your book, it was...
Yeah, I call Lead Yourself First, Inspiring Leadership Through Solitude.
Thanks again for joining us. Really appreciated the time. Like I said, we're going to finish recording and probably chat for another 15 hours after this, but thanks for being here and good luck with everything that you're doing in the future.